Hi, I'm Martin. I'm a member of Counterfire in Manchester. I'm very pleased to be speaking with Stephen Whittle, who is a British gas worker based in and around Greater Manchester, who's currently on strike. Stephen, before we talk about the action that you're involved in, could you just tell us a little bit about yourselves and indeed your history with British Gas?
Yeah, so I two paid into British Gas from being a subcontractor into British Gas, and I became a union rep for them 11 years ago. At the beginning, it was a sort of an anti-union place where I worked, and we, over the period of time, built it up into a place where we had 97% density and smart over 2,000 engineers all as members within the GMB, and turned it into a better way of working. And then until this year, where March came, all of a sudden that relationship just sort of started deteriorating with fire and rehire during sort of the first lockdown.
Okay. I mean, you've nicely led me there into the next question anyway, which was, of course, to ask you if you could say something about the situation you're in now and why the workers are taking the action they're taking.
Yeah, I mean, there's many reasons. I think people initially, well, the company initially felt that what the reason why the workers are fighting is actually around money. Actually, the main priorities for the workforce is around work-life balance, people with families wanting to be able to spend time with their children, and job security. Ultimately, people just want to feel secure in their job, and fire and rehire has gone completely against that. And also the attacks within the terms and conditions, the vast majority of the attacks are around the work-life balance, making people work more hours, more antisocial shifts, and effectively paying them less to do so.
Yes, indeed. And of course, this tactic of fire and rehire is not just happening at British Gas at the moment. It's become worryingly common in the last year or so and seems to be, I would say, a major weapon that's being used by the bosses against workers in the current situation. And indeed, it's been reported that 9% of workers have been threatened with fire and rehire since COVID began, which is 12 months near as damn it now, isn't it? And it's appalling that workers, of course, are being treated in this way. What do you think in general needs to be done to combat it? Obviously, you're taking a strike action that you're taking, but is there anything else you'd say about how people can fight against fire and rehire?
Yeah, and it's something we've been mindful of all the way through. When we first started, there was maybe two companies that had fire and rehire. As we've gone through, you hear more and more companies. That's the first time I'd heard the 9%, but it's genuinely worrying. And I think the first thing that we've got to do is get unionized. Ultimately, in employment law at the minute, everything's inside of the companies, and the only way that we fight it is genuinely industrial strength, standing together, withholding our service like we are doing now. So I think that's the first thing that we've got to do. We've got to get more people joining in the unions, and we've got to get more people willing to fight for these, because genuinely, if you do fight, you can win. And then I think secondly, we've got to start using our political strength to start moving and changing the laws around this. Ultimately, where we are now, we've been told, and we've recorded, all parties are against fire and rehire being used as a negotiating tactic, yet it's still in place. So now we've got to hold people to what they've said. People like Boris Johnson, who have openly said that they think it's a bad tactic to use for negotiation. And we've got to hold them to actually changing it and actually give us the ability to be able to negotiate rather than have this gun to their heads. So I think they're the two main things I think we need to focus on.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I mean, I do wonder, I'm speculating here, whether there are actually a number of people in the country who don't even know about fire and hire, aren't actually aware that that's a thing that companies are allowed to do. I mean, because in a way, when people first hear about it, there is a level of shock there potentially. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about what the feeling's like on the picket lines as well, and just anything about which picket lines you've indeed been on. So I'm assuming you've been on, at Stockport, but perhaps you've been on some other ones as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the feeling, it's been a roller coaster. People have felt invigorated large periods of time, but also they are losing thousands of pounds through this. So there has been that element of realism in all of this. This isn't, there's almost that romance of picket lines, etc. But actually, this is really hitting people hard. Nobody ever wants to strike, but they've felt they've had to. So there's been a real roller coaster of emotions, but there's a very strong belief that we can win, and there has been all the way through this, and there's been a real solidarity in it. I think it's been difficult to sort of mobilize as you normally would because of COVID and the restrictions around it. And obviously we've got to do the right thing as regards to that, but there's been a real feeling of solidarity and winning mentality. The pickets I've seen lots of different pickets. I've seen Stockport's the predominant one, but there's also been pickets that has been done around sort of what's called buy box locations, which is effectively where we pick up our stock. And there's been a lot of those done because we're remote workers. It's very hard for us to picket areas, so we've just been able to picket offices. So the way that people have been doing it is by going to different buy boxes, and the feeling from those, there's been hundreds of those up and down the country. And that's been a real show of strength for people, because one of the things, the tactics that the company's used is make people feel isolated, and people seeing lots of different engineers, whether they've picketed their own vans, buy boxes or offices. It's made people feel together, and sort of move away from that sort of isolated feeling. So it's definitely helped people sharing those pictures.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And what kind of support have you received? I'm talking about obviously from people outside of British Gas, and what has it meant to you?
Genuinely, this was a concern, because during the COVID, you're going into the strike. I remember the first day I went to the Stockport picket, you turn up and you think, oh, how are the public going to react? Because there's a lot of things going on with COVID. There's a lot of things, financial restraints, paying freezes, etc. But unbelievable support from the public. Every car that was going past was pumping their horn, full of support. Every person that would come in to talk to you in the street, seeing that you're in strike, and would come and speak to you and ask for you, and they've just been overwhelming. The support we've seen through the question and answers to the company on their company sort of sites, fully supportive of everything that we're trying to do. When we've been going into customers' houses, again, fully supportive of what we're trying to do. So it's been overwhelming, the public support, but also politicians and sort of social media famous people. So the amount of people that have come through as supporting us, like famous people and politicians, has been incredible, genuinely, and it's been heartwarming, and it has lifted people. When Chris O'Shea went in front of the select committee, that gave people a real shot in the arm, and that only happened because of the sort of coordination of politicians across all parties getting him up there, because he didn't want to be up there. So it genuinely does make a big difference for us.
No, it's really great to hear that, though. I have to say, I'm not surprised. I mean, I think, there is if you like, a disconnect between the level of support that workers tend to get when they're on strike and how it's represented in the media, which would have you believe that, that strikes are simply about how they inconvenience the rest of the population, particularly if it's transport related, obviously. But, I'm not surprised. I was involved, as many people were, towards the end of last year with a cavalcade for the Rolls-Royce workers up in Barnoldswick. And it felt like the whole of Burnley and Nelson had come out for that. I mean, there was a huge amount of people involved, and people have based on the levels of, and I would say based on the levels of wealth, people of all backgrounds as well, actually, which was interesting to see. Last question, really. What can anyone watching this do to support you and your fellow workers while the strike continues?
I think the main thing I would ask is realize that our strength is in the industrial strength by standing together. Really believe that actually in whatever industry you're in, standing together, most companies are nothing without its workforce. So I think believe in that, and ultimately joining the union on the back of that type of thing, and organising is probably the first thing, so that we're not reliant upon employment law. We're reliant upon ourselves and our industrial strength. I think that's one of the things, but then just spread the word. Fire and rehire is a disgusting tactic and is one that's on growing. So I think talk to each other about it. This process is sort of almost existing in the dark to an extent. And I think the more that we can throw the light on it, the better it is, because these politicians have all said that they don't like it, but yet it's still in place. And I think the more that we can put a light on it, the more that we can share it and talk about it, the more likely it is to put pressure on them to actually do something and match the words with the actions by getting rid of it. And I think they're the two big asks that I would have.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us today, Stephen. I think, and Counterfire, of course, thinks that it's very important what you're doing and what your fellow workers are doing. So just sort of with saying solidarity in the struggles ahead. And I hope you win, obviously. Thanks very much,
appreciate
Stephen.
It. Thank you for having me.